try to email Catherine.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope if you're having trouble hearing us or anything, just speak up. If you got to raise your hand function or just interrupt and let us know. I'm glad everybody could take their time out today. If there's any newcomers, welcome to the FILO program work group. Basically a brainstorming group for thinking through some topics and issues that the INLUFI program faces here in Kentucky. So it's been a very good, productive discussion thus far. Today, from our commissioner's office, they were unable to make it. We have Jenny Gilbert. She worked closely with them, and Scott and I have been working closely with them as well to make sure that we're all on the same page and moving forward. And so we've got full support with that, and really looking forward to continuing the discussion. So I'm gonna put my screen share back on and kind of start rolling through here. We're a little bit thin because of the legislative session is in, but I appreciate I think they've got a proxy on here, at least one, and just a reminder, we're live streaming, so that's available if you want to share that link with anybody. It'll record and be available after the meeting as well for however long we need it to. The past meetings are up there in addition to this one. So I hope everybody's healthy and staying warm in this nice cold spell we've got here. So like I said, I'm going to start sharing the screen and we'll dive in. Sorry about that. I had the live stream on, so there's a little bit of lag time, but we're good.
Lauren, when we conclude this, would you mind sending Rob and or I your contact information so we can include you with anything that goes out? We don't have your direct contact information. So at the conclusion of the meeting, we'll give you our contact information. And if you could just forward us yours, we'll make sure you're on the list.
Yes, thank you. All right. Perfect. Okay, well, let's dive back in here. I'll share. Okay. So there's our beginning screen. So hopefully, as we're quite a bit further into the meeting, number 4 it is, we will be able to rely more on discussion, and because we've all gotten a lot of information about the program and about some issues so far. And today, while I'm waiting for the slideshow to get going, we will be hearing from a new presenter, Dr. Clark from University of Kentucky, and we'll introduce him a little bit more formally in a couple of slides. But I'm looking forward to his presentation. He'll tell you all about that. And just to remind everybody that stay safe outdoors, but enjoy it. The program prioritizes restored protected habitats, recreational opportunities, clean water, and economic growth, the last of which is topic of the day. If you don't know who else is in the meeting, you need to try the participants, but also just let me know, and I can I'll try to save that list afterwards if anyone needs it. Today we're gonna give you a quick update since our last meeting. Mention a few topics about some discussions that we've had just in and about members and other stakeholders. We'll hear from Dr. Clark, as I mentioned. And following that up, I would like to show you guys kind of a program status, something that came about as part of a discussion with Catherine Burney, who presented to us last time. And I think it'll help us all understand a little more about the progress of these projects and in mitigation projects in general, but specifically the FILO program projects. That'll be a little bit of a deep dive, so you'll have to bear with me when we get there. And then we'll think through some what the work group's purpose is, maybe, and depending on how the discussion goes, we can be pretty free with that. Talk a little bit about statutes and acknowledge some pitfalls that we need to be aware of and be careful about. And then we'll finish up, see if there's any new objectives that we need to add into what we're already working on. And thinking maybe last week of February for meeting number 5. So I appreciate everybody's attention today. Some of the high points from last time I'd like to mention, because we had some really good presentations and they're worth noting. Brian Miller from HBA came basically as a representative of not just HBA, but a permittee, a developer, somebody who might need credits, and some priorities for him, clear priorities that just and not to take away, because it was a long and very good discussion, but basically ample credits are what permittees want in all possible areas, and they want it at the lowest price. And I know that seems sort of elementary, but I think it's worth stating that we kind of stick close to that goal. And I know the judge wasn't able to attend last time, I think, but I know he's here now. But I know a priority for him is that and for many of us is that we consider the impact in the communities where those permittees and develops are happening, and that we keep the mitigation as close to those areas as we can. Not just a service area, but more sort of impact centric. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And that is part of our site selection process to the extent that it is meaningful and practical. But at times that conflicts with the lowest possible cost. So that's a balancing act that we're, always cognizant of. And again, like I said, worth mentioning. We also heard from Catherine Burney. She gave us a very good review of how the FILO program and in-lieu fee programs in general work in concert with mitigation banks, because we have very similar goals. While not always 100% equivalent, there's definitely a lot of overlap there and a lot of processing overlap with some important distinctions. So that was good as well. If anybody missed it or wants to has any questions or discussion about that, and we can maybe cover that today or follow up with me afterwards. And I sent out, maybe not everybody saw them, it was a little bit tucked in our meeting invite, but I included some topics just to see if anybody had some thoughts about those and any sort of ideas that were rolling around, just kind of a discussion starter or conversation starter. But I didn't get a tremendous amount of feedback, but what little feedback I did get, common to that was always general support for there to be a statewide in-lieu fee program, and that functions well, and also general support for the full delivery procurement style as an additional contracting tool, and we are definitely in support of that, especially if we can, make adjustments to the property acquisition and the service and credit delivery payout milestones, which we got into. We may mention again today, but we definitely got into deeper last time for that review. And then the last thing is that the timing is important. As far as implementing these projects as efficiently and as we can. We definitely have regulatory brackets on that. But really, quality and correlating benefits to the Commonwealth are factors that we can't ignore that are maybe not quite as high priority as the timing, but certainly up there and a big weight on how we make decisions on what projects we do and in what order we do them. So I think we're all on the same page with all that at this point. Again, any questions, just let me know. There we go. All right, so I'm going to pause here and introduce Dr. Clark. I've had a couple of good discussions with him and sharing of information, and he put together a report. So I'd like him to talk about that, and I'm going to let him share screen or just present, however he'd like to do that. And he can steer if he wants people to wait for questions at the end or integrate them in as we go. Certainly he'll let you know how to proceed there. So I'm going to stop my screen share momentarily. And Dr. Clark, are you wanting to share your screen or?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. It may ask me if to allow that.
Yeah, it's telling me host disabled right now.
Okay, so we did this before.
You need to click that off. There you go.
There we go. I got it.
Okay. You see an intro slide?
Yes, sir.
All right, sounds good. Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk with you. It sounds like there's been a considerable amount of discussion already occurring since this is meeting number 4. I'm assuming you've kind of worked through a lot of these issues already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of the highlights associated with this, assuming that everybody has a pretty strong background on how the program works already. So first, I want to present just kind of an overview of what we've done. So first of all, just kind of acknowledgement that the analysis or the review that we've conducted was funded by Ecosystem Investment Partners. And when we did this, we really had kind of 2 kind of primary goals associated with this. One was to basically compare the mitigation process or progress that has been made in Kentucky to some other states to get an idea of how we are progressing in Kentucky. And then also to look at the economic impacts associated with this. We're going to talk about a few other things, but those were kind of the big goals that we had. And to do this, what we primarily did is we looked through the annual reports, data that was provided by the program staff, and conducted interviews with staff from Kentucky and other states. And I do want to express my appreciation to the department staff, particularly Rob and Scott, who spent basically an entire Friday afternoon talking with me about the program, how it worked. So I really appreciate their cooperation. In terms of kind of the big findings that we have, there are a few things that I kind of wanted to point out. The annual reports provide a lot of really great information, but one of the things that kind of struck me is I didn't get a good sense of kind of the program's overall financial status and how that was changing. I'll explain that a little bit more, but again, there's a lot of great report or great information there. But one of the things that I'd like to see is, more information about the program status. The other kind of big thing that we saw was that it does appear that Kentucky tends to be less efficient or maybe making slower progress might be a better way to describe this than some of the other states. Not all states, but some of the other states in terms of meeting the mitigation obligations. And so we're going to talk about kind of those findings. And we really I only have really one recommendation here. Our analysis was a pretty short analysis. We only have a certain amount of resources that we could dedicate to this. And so as we work through this, we realize this is a really important but complicated program. And so a lot of what you're going to hear me talk about is, kind of things that we learned, but there's some caveats here. And I think policymakers would be well served by having a more complete review of this program that can be done by an external group that could bring the resources to really fully understand how this program is working and fully analyze this. And this can be done by the state auditor or the legislature's Program Review and Investigations Committee. And I know whenever somebody hears something like, oh, well, we need to have the auditors come in, that raises some concerns. There's nothing in terms of what we saw in terms of financial issues, that caused me concern. It's just, again, this is a complicated program where, it would be really helpful to have an external review that provide a really good understanding of how the program works and how it is meeting its obligation to perform mitigation. Okay, so a couple of big sections that I want to talk through. And the first is kind of a real quick financial status of the program. You've probably already seen this before, since again, you're in meeting number 4. But the program is primarily funded, of course, by the sale of credits. And so here we can see data that the department provided in terms of the receipts that they've been able to collect from the sale of credits. And you see, this varies substantially, based on the project growth, that is being done out there. But we're talking about, some pretty substantial amounts of money over time. Those funds, as they're collected, are generally distributed to 3 funds. The administrative funds, as I understand it, the agreement with the Corps of Engineer and the department allows them to keep up to 20%. It doesn't appear that they're typically keeping that maximum amount, so they're only taking a portion of what they're allowed to. The second bucket that these funds go into is the reserve funds, which of course, are there for providing for the long-term monitoring and maintenance of any projects that are completed. The rest of the funds basically then are put into project funds. And so these are the funds that are available to perform the mitigation activity. We go through and we summarize some of the information from the annual reports. The annual reports provide a really good understanding of where the reserve funds stand. So you can go through and you can track these over time, and you can see kind of the beginning cash balance, the ending cash balance, what has changed in terms of the additional revenues that came in from the sale of credits, and a portion being allocated to reserve funds, and expenditures associated with that. So you can see that this fund is growing. There's good information associated with this. The other big bucket, again, administrative funds. We also see a good reporting of what is going on in terms of these administrative funds. You can see, the amount varies quite a bit from year to year. The revenue has, that has gone into this fund has ranged from 1 million to 2019, there was 6.8 million. Operating expenditures and other expenditures typically run about 1.3 million a year, but there are some years where it's a bit higher. So in 2017, it was approaching about 3. In 2019, it was about $3 million. The year-end balance has been growing, and as of 2019, it was about 14.3 million. And so, as you compare this to the operating expenditures, there seems to be a healthy balance there. They seem to have enough administrative funds that even if you use the highest year in terms of expenses, they would have enough for about 4 or 5 years. So the administrative funds seem very healthy, and there's good information being reported here. One of the places that we felt information could be improved on is what is happening with the project funds. They do a good job of showing you how the revenues are being allocated to projects, or as credits are sold and revenues received, how much is going to this project fund. And here you can see in this slide the amount of funds that are going to these projects and how this is accumulating over time. What I had trouble understanding was the expenditures associated with these funds and the overall fund balance and how that was changing over time. So I think that's a place where the department can improve its reporting, because as I looked at this, it was not clear to me where the fund balance stood over time. I think this had been reported in previous annual reports, but I didn't see it in the more recent ones. Okay, let's talk quickly about the progress on projects. So one of the things, as we listened to some of the testimony that was provided in committee earlier in the year, one of the things that we heard a lot about was concerns that maybe Kentucky wasn't making as much progress in terms of mitigation. So we wanted to understand how projects were kind of moving through the mitigation progress. So what we tried to do here is basically track projects based on the information that is provided in the annual reports. This was challenging, to say the least. We basically pulled the annual reports for several years and started trying to track programs or individual projects over time. This was challenging because there seemed to be, at least to us, some inconsistent names in the annual reports. And this could have to do with maybe changes to how the program or how the project is going through the process. You know, if there are changes where maybe you're combining projects or breaking projects out, or maybe changing the scope, maybe names are changing. But you know, in terms of the information we had, what we really tried to do is identify what seemed to be individual projects and see how they were moving through the process over time. Because what the annual report does is it basically provides a list of all the different projects and tells you kind of what the status is. So we identified what looked like 174 individual projects. Now, the 2019 report indicated there were 128 projects. So again, you know, this kind of indicates to you that maybe we've struggled a little bit in terms of being able to identify individual projects. Now, what we did is we basically tried to say, for those projects that we saw, how many years of the annual report did they show up in these different phases? Now, the definition of phases do kind of change a little bit over time. So we've tried to put them into these 4 different categories. Yeah, how long did they stay in approval? Or how many years of the annual report were they reported as being in approval, design, construction, and in monitoring? So what the table does is it basically says, okay, for the projects we identified, how many years did it seem to be in, say, the approval status or the design status? So for example, if you look at the design column and you read down to years in status, we see that there were 8 projects that seemed to be in the design status for 4 years, 6 projects that seemed to be in the design status for 5 years, and so on. So as we look at this, a couple of caveats we need to kind of keep in mind. We're using all the projects here, regardless of kind of how long they've been out there. Ideally, what we would do is we'd have enough projects where we could look at this and we can say, okay, how long did they move through all these progress, and only count those that were either completed or terminated in some way. But here, because of the number of projects, we felt it made some sense to go ahead and include all projects. Projects that are maybe new are going to show up in that approval stage, or maybe have just moved to a new phase are going to show up in that phase, and maybe only be 1 year. So to some degree, what this does is it kind of reduces the amount of time or our estimate to the amount of time that projects spent in these different states or stages. Given that caveat, what we kind of see is that projects seem to be in the design phase for a relatively long period of time. Approval process, you know, they seem to show up in maybe 1 or 2 annual reports typically. For the design stage, they seem to be showing up in quite a few annual reports. And so on average, we see about 3.7 years of the annual reports. Construction process doesn't seem to take very long. You know, those are about 1.7. And of course, monitoring, you know, that tends to be a longer process. So kind of what we're seeing here suggests that we have a lot of projects that kind of get into this design phase and they tend to stay there for a period of time. So for example, again, you know, we had some projects that were in the design phase for 4, 5, 6 or more years. The other thing we wanted to look at or talk about today was terminated projects. For our 174 projects that we identified, which again is inconsistent with what the annual report said. You know, the annual report said that they thought there were 128 projects, so our counting may be off. But we identified about 55 projects, or about 32%, that were listed as being terminated. Now, 2019 annual report, they identified 47 projects that had been terminated, so that's about 37%. In some of the annual reports, and I'm sure you've discussed this in some of your previous meetings, But in some of the annual reports, they actually provided a reason for the termination. And so we had reasons for about 21 of these projects. And typically the reason was landowner issues. And talking with staff, they confirmed that this seemed to be, kind of one of the big things that tends to cause these projects to maybe get terminated or take a long time to complete. A lot of this has to do with maybe the landowner maybe losing interest in the project. When a price is actually offered, they may be unwilling to accept the price. And in both the annual reports and talking with staff, they noted that mineral rights can be an issue in terms of acquiring the property. So terminated projects are not necessarily a concern. Okay, so I think, when we see terminated projects, we may start to get concerned. Why are these projects being terminated? And I want to be careful here. And I think there's information in terms of understanding why some of these programs or some of these projects don't move forward, and some of the challenges that maybe the department faces in performing mitigation. But we want to be careful because we don't want to say, okay, well, we have these projects being terminated. You shouldn't be terminating projects. Well, that could be problematic, right? Because if we start telling the department don't terminate projects, then these projects could be lasting longer and longer, and they may not be projects that could actually go forward. So I want to be a little bit careful. Again, there's a lot of good information in terms of looking at these terminated projects and understanding what challenges we have in completing the mitigation. But we want to be careful that we don't say, oh, well, terminated projects are a bad thing, because we don't want to keep putting good money to a bad project or a project that can't go forward. Now, one of the concerns here potentially is that there are expenditures or potentially expenditures associated with these projects. And so it's unclear that as projects maybe move through some of the process and there are expenditures associated with this, to what degree are they actually helping to meet the mitigation obligations, and to what extent are they using these expenditures? So I think this is one of the areas where some additional research would be really helpful, or some additional analysis would be really helpful for understanding how the program is working. Okay, so one of the other things we wanted to do is kind of get a sense, if we could, of how Kentucky is faring relative to other states. There seem to be some concerns that maybe we're not progressing as quickly. So what we attempted to do is basically look at this using credit transactions. And so, all states report their credit transactions to the Corps of Engineers. So that data is available. And so what we were basically trying to do is look at how these credits are kind of being sold and how they are being released. And so the idea is, when a credit is sold, that is representing an obligation to provide mitigation at some point in the future. As credits are released, that is representing progress towards meeting some of that mitigation. Now, you've probably already discussed this, but you should understand that when credits are released, they can be released along different phases of the program or the project, as the project meets different milestones. So under the instrument, it appears that Kentucky can release 15% of credits when easements are obtained, 5% upon approval by the Corps of Engineers. And then as actual progress is made in terms of meeting the performance, they can start to release more. So again, the idea here is that if we can see how credits are being sold, the amount that they're being sold, we're getting a sense of the mitigation obligation. As we are seeing credits released, we are seeing some indication of progress towards meeting that mitigation. So this slide, we're showing Kentucky compared to a few other states. And so you can see here the cumulative stream credits that are being withdrawn or sold, and those are in blue, and in red, you're seeing the release credits. And so this follows from 2010 to 2020. So what you can see is, you can see the, for Kentucky, the first chart there, you're seeing how, basically you're seeing a measure of the obligation to mitigate streams. In the red, you're seeing the release credits, and so you're seeing some of the progress towards meeting that. Now, there's some caveats that we've got to talk about. The first is that credits can reflect different characteristics across different states. Here, we're only using stream credits, but those credits can still be different, and states may face different issues in terms of meeting those different types of stream credits. So keep that in mind. The other is there do appear to be some differences in how states are reporting their data to the Corps of Engineers. Now, Kentucky, of course, because we have access to staff here, and we can talk with them, and we can kind of work through some of the data that they have. We're able to go through and really understand very well what's being reported to the Corps of Engineers in Kentucky, and it matches up very well with what is in the annual reports. We weren't able to do that for other states, but one of the concerns that I have, for example, is if you look at North Carolina, it appears to suggest that they're releasing more credits than they are selling. And so that causes me a little bit of concern. Certainly they seem to be releasing a lot of credits, as we're seeing in red, but it suggests to me that the data that they provide to Ribbits seems to be missing some of the sale of credits at some point in time. And so, we're not getting a good sense of what their overall obligation necessarily was. Now for Kentucky, credits sold as of 2000 or through 2020 was about 515,000 credits. They've released about 24,000 credits. And I think in the annual report, we cited a number of 11,000, and that is incorrect. It's actually, I think, around 24,000. As we look across some of the other states, we see that some states do seem to be releasing considerably more credits than Kentucky, seem to be making more progress. Tennessee, for example, seems to be making more progress. Virginia seems to be making more progress, but it seems to be a much smaller program. But we also see some states that are maybe struggling. Ohio, for example, we're not seeing a whole lot of credits being released in Ohio. That could be due to the age of the program. There could be a number of stories possibly explaining that. But again, kind of what we're seeing here is that Kentucky seems to be making maybe slower progress than what we're seeing in some states, but not in other states. Oh, the other thing I want to talk about, and we talk about this a little bit more in the report, is what's going on in North Carolina. So it sounds like you talked about this quite a bit, but when we talked with North Carolina staff, what they described to us is that they had a kind of a very similar program to Kentucky years ago, and they made some changes that basically allowed them to do that full delivery. So one of the concerns, or one of the issues, that we've discussed, and I'm sure you've discussed in previous meetings, has to do with the difficulty of acquiring land. One of the things that was noteworthy about what North Carolina does is that because of the full delivery and the way that they've been doing that for a period of time, it is pushing the obligation to acquire these easements to these private companies that are performing the mitigation. And as a result of that, and the fact that they kind of understand that these opportunities are coming, it seems like they are able to acquire the land before the credits are actually needed. And so that seems to allow them to turn around the mitigation process quite a bit quicker. Okay, so let's talk about the economic impacts. Now, when we first started doing this, the idea was really to look at the idea that, well, when there's mitigation activity, there's employment, and really kind of looking at how much employment could be associated with mitigation activity, and how much employment could the mitigation funds that have been collected contribute towards employment. As I listened to testimony and talked with staff, one of the things that came up was this concern that a lack of mitigations may be inhibiting economic growth in some way. So remember, again, you've probably already covered this. The idea is that most of these areas have been allocated a certain amount of advance credits that can be sold. And as they sell that balance goes down. And the concern becomes when those credits are gone, that there would not be credits for new development that could potentially occur. So here, what we're basically showing is kind of the balance of credits across the different service areas in Kentucky over time. And so, most of these areas seem to have a pretty healthy balance of credits. So a lack of credits in most of these areas doesn't seem to be a huge constraint. Now, there may be other constraints, right? And there's certainly a couple of areas where maybe there is an issue. Northern Kentucky, for example, I think we all understand that, there aren't a whole lot of credits or any credits may be available in Northern Kentucky at this point. So those, have either sold out or pretty much sold out. And so that could potentially create an issue at some point in time. In the Salt River area, there was a substantial amount of credits purchased in the past. That tends to be down to about 47% of its available advanced credits. So, there's still a lot of credits there. But, if there were a large project, could it potentially use that? Well, potentially. Now, it's really not clear to what extent this is inhibiting economic growth. Most areas seem to have available credits. The other thing that could be going on is that if there is limited credits, they could potentially be going to the private mitigation banks to purchase credits. So, just kind of casually looking at this, the argument that a lack of credits is not or is constraining, that seems to only potentially be an issue in a couple of areas. Most areas, it doesn't seem to be an issue. The degree to which it is an issue, I think, could maybe be answered better by looking at permits or applications for permits and whether those are being denied due to a lack of having a mitigation credit. Okay, so let's go back and kind of talk about the main thing that I was looking at in terms of the economic impact. The idea here is, you're collecting these revenues. What type of jobs could potentially be associated with that spending? So what we basically did is we used kind of standard economic impact analysis for this to look at spending in particular sectors and see what kind of jobs could potentially be related to that and what kind of income it can support. Our estimate is that roughly $1 million in project spending can support about 7 to 9 jobs, with incomes ranging from about $324,000 to $565,000 in terms of labor income. That's going to vary considerably across the different geographic areas, partially because of the jobs that are available there, how much they actually may have to import some of that work, and the wages associated with the area. To provide a sense of the scale of this, what we've done is we've provided the estimates across the different service areas and applied that to the amount of project funds that have been collected within those different areas. So for example, in the Big Sandy River area, there was about $18.7 million collected from that area. And we estimate that that could support about 154 jobs. Now, we really need to kind of keep this in perspective. Some of these funds may have already been spent on previous mitigation projects. So we may have already realized some of those jobs. And also those jobs are going to occur as additional funds are spent. So here I'm talking about the total amount of funds that were collected. Some of those jobs may again have already been realized. Some of those jobs may be realized in the future. So this gives us kind of a sense of what that economic impact potentially can be for those different areas. So again, kind of summing things up, again, there was some concern in terms of the annual reports not providing a clear indication of the program financial status. I think it would be really helpful to beef that information up in the annual reports. Kentucky does seem to be taking a longer time relative to some other states. This really seems to be with the design phase taking a long period of time and these land acquisition challenges. North Carolina's program appear to have addressed some of these challenges. They do seem to be able to turn these around faster. We don't know any other qualitative issues associated with that, but that is a program that I think is worth looking at. And in terms of the economic constraints, there is some economic impact to this spending. We think that's clear. It's not clear, however, to what extent the credits are constraining economic development. It could be in certain areas, but I think we'd really have to have more information to really fully understand the degree to which that is constraining additional development. Again, I just kind of want to conclude on the idea that, or the recommendation that an external review by the Auditor of Public Accounts or the Program Review Investigation Committee, both of these groups could provide much more resources to look at this program than we can provide, and provide a really good perspective on how the program is performing, and also make some, particularly the program review committee could make some comparisons to how this is being done in other states. So that concludes my comments, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Before I dive in, because I have several things I kind of like to maybe address some of the questions that you had as you went through. But also, I think before that, it'd be better to open up to the work group members at large, just to see if there's some general questions or even specific questions that they have. So I don't want to get in the way of that. Everybody's a little sleepy this morning. Well, maybe if I just go ahead, then that might generate some discussion. And again, I appreciate this. I think it's done really well. In your presentation, I actually cleared a few questions that I had just upon looking through the report. And maybe the thing to do would be to, if you don't mind, to reshare the screen, and we'll just walk back through the presentation, because there's a few times like a slider here, kind of as we progress through, that I could maybe provide some additional information or just make some points. So just, I guess, starting near the beginning. Okay. You can get some advanced forward one. I would like to say that as far as the annual reports go, the intention of the annual report isn't to take the place of an audit. It's actually specifically tailored to information that the Corps of Engineers requires of us. But we have been audited multiple times in the past. I don't know exactly who did the audits. I'm thinking at least one was one of the groups that you mentioned, the state auditor, I think. And not too long ago, maybe 2018 or 19. So that is something that we're open to, and we're actually happy to enhance the annual report to maybe pick up some of that, but I also don't want to bog it down from a core reporting standpoint either. So it's easy to add appendices to that for additional and supporting information, so I could envision doing some things there to address some of the questions that you had. But I just want to make sure everybody kind of understands that our program annual report isn't intended to be an audit, but we have done them, and in our agreement with the Corps, and it may even say in the rule that that there's an expectation that we can be asked to do audits, and so we have a lot more information about the program and the the intricacies and details. It's just not part of the actual annual report. So just a kind of a general statement there. And then keep next slide. Let's see, I didn't do a good job writing down. Keep going. I mean, I think this one here. I think it's important to note as well, because a big portion of the reason why we're here is because there's been a narrative kind of with the legislature and roundabout that, the program has 150 million or some number of that range $1 million that they're just not spending, or that it's there's some kind of shell game going on or something of that nature. And this picture is very good But and we use something similar to this with a lot of our presentations and people who have interest in the program. Something similar that kind of addresses that large balance in part, not in full, is that project funds box. If you take the tree you formed one step further, it's actually 22 individual buckets of funds. So there's no version of us being able to do tremendously enormous projects, or that 150 million, whatever that number is on a given day, as a project fund balance, without worrying, without being concerned of what it is already allocated to. It is distributed among all the service areas and not equal. The funds in the service area stay in the service area. So that's kind of an important thing to know, that we don't get to just throw all the funding in any one direction. So I just want to point that out as well.
Scott, I'm sorry, Rob, can I comment on that?
Absolutely.
So I understand the annual report is something that you specifically have to do for the Corps of Engineer, but it's also kind of the main document that demonstrates what's happening with the program. So I think it's important to understand that even though, it may be a specific obligation to meet a specific provision that you've got to meet, it is also the document that many people are looking at as they're thinking about, what's going on with this program. So I think providing more information about where that balance stands, how these expenditures have occurred, provides a better understanding of what is going on in the program. And so I think that would be really helpful. And so, what you're describing in terms of, the project funds, there's a lot more going on in terms of those that are, is complicated. That comes out more as you provide more information demonstrating, okay, here's what we've been doing, here's the expenditures that we've been making and how those balances have been changing. So I think that's still really helpful information for people to understand what exactly is going on with the program.
I agree with you 100%. And so, like I said, I'm definitely open to enhancing the annual report, or at least maybe some supplemental or sort of corollary documents that could be produced on the same period to go with the annual report. So like I said, I think that's a great idea. So I'm all for that. And again, we've got the information, so we should be able to create some with some regularity. What you're asking. But to keep going, please, if you don't mind, forward. Yeah, this was good. Matches. Keep going. Let's see, hang on. Okay, yes, here. I'm listened really intently to your description of this, and I understood it a lot better than I had when reading it. And just to give a little bit of insight, I think you guys, with the information you had, probably did the best you could here, and it's not way out of line from an anecdotal recollecting. There's a couple things I could clean up, or at least give some context for. Monitoring of mitigation projects is a minimum of 5 years. You're seeing 4.3 just because there's a lot of projects that are just getting started. And in some cases, it's a 10-year monitoring period, and that's all post-construction. So, as our projects age, that number will become better. I just want to clear that up. I don't think anybody really has a big concern about the time we spend in monitoring, because that's after the bulk of the funds have been implemented.
But I think one of the things I'd like to point out, and it kind of ties into your slide about credits released, where you've got the time frame on here. One of the things I think is that slide showing the credit release is very good in that it's actually a recognition of the extrinsic factor that basically from December 2015 until January of 2019, the ability of the program to go out and acquire property had pretty much shut down. The previous administration only allowed 6 acquisitions, or six or eight acquisitions, with the bulk of them being up in northern Kentucky, directly related to Amazon. And in order to release credits, you actually have to have the property and you have to actually have the project underway. And I think that release slide ties directly into the fact that we had a significant lag time in the ability to even acquire projects. Whereas since August of 2020, and in the last calendar year in particular, we've closed on 15 properties. And since, I guess, September of 2020, add in an additional, so we're up to 20 properties since September of 2020, whereas the December 15 to January 2019, we weren't able to acquire any. So I think, this slide here showing the time ties directly into that credit release. And I think that's a good recognition of the accurate status of what we were dealing with.
Yeah, I think we've got to be a little bit careful here. I mean, again, the program has been running for a long time, and it sounds like, it's struggled to make progress purchasing some of these properties. And that has, really contributed to, these projects being kind of stuck in this design phase is what it sounds like. I mean, is that reasonable?
That's spot on. I mean, really, I would expect the design phase, depending on the complexity of the project or logistics, anywhere from, it really matters about what the project is, but it should be closer to a year than 4 years. Just grossly stating it. And
right. So,
I think we exacerbate the design time because of the way we do our contracting. So just to give some meat on that bone, so to speak, we may begin a design contract with our engineering consultants and for them to help us find a project. So in some cases, a project may fall in a design category concurrent with the approval time. You see what I'm saying? So there's a lot of oddity with the way we use our consultants that over expands that design time, even without regard to what Scott's referring to, as far as we kind of had we had so many projects stack up in the property phase and not really get out of it for such a long period of time. Those two factors, the way we use our consultants in a project can appear in a design phase, even though they're not necessarily actively designing or sending us invoices for design because they're not to that point yet. But I don't know that this is really a critical issue. I think it's just what you're seeing is the exact problem that you had when looking at it. It's like it's not always clear what phase a project is in. And that's because we overlap the design with approval and construction, and in a lot of cases monitoring as well. So you see a lot of weirdness there, honestly.
And the time involved in core review, which is the same thing that the private industry has to deal with, as well as the ultimate decision making for the mitigation is the cores.
Right. So anyway, and then I'm not complaining about what you got here. I didn't want to give that impression, but certainly I think you're identifying what you're seeing as an extended design period is a result of a lot of things. A major significant one being what Scott mentioned is as we've recently, like since the 2019 annual report, which was the newest one you had available, since that time, we've kind of resolved a lot of the property issues. So, including the 2020 and 21 now in this kind of if you were to update this data, I'd be really interested to see if that's made some significant changes.
So as somebody who's done a lot of these studies over a lot of years, one of the things that I point out is that, we have historically, I think there's sounds like there's pretty widespread recognition that there have been some problems in the past. And the program is not a new program, it's a pretty old program. And there have been some acknowledgments of this and some changes that we hope are going to speed this up, and maybe it starts to show up in the release of credits and in terms of the actual completion of the projects. What I would be looking at as somebody who has done a lot of program review studies is what evidence is there. And so, Scott, I hear you talking about 15 properties or whatever, and that's great. I mean, that's really encouraging. I'd probably question a little bit about, well, is that enough? What is that going to translate into in terms of actual releases? Because, I mean, are they 15 small properties, 15 large properties? I'd really want more perspective on that. But I do think it's something worth checking and monitoring to get a sense of, is this actually going to permanently solve the challenge that we've had in this?
And I think the kind of the follow-up to when we get through this spreadsheet that Catherine helped me with may answer some of exactly what you're saying, like kind of it's almost like an update about project status and maybe looking forward. You can kind of forecast a little bit. So I hope you're able to stick with us long enough to get there today. So anyway, we don't have to keep harping on this. I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that you've identified an issue that is a lot of issues kind of rolled into one, and one significant of which we feel like we have addressed significantly, if not completely, in the property acquisition phase.
Yeah. And I think that's really where the value from something like a program review study comes from, because what's different in these types of studies is it's not so much like an audit, like the audits that you've been subject to before. It more has to do with the process, and do these changes that you've made seem to be addressing the challenges? So that's where a program review study could really differ from an auditor study.
Yes, so far it's been really good. So let's keep going. We can move on from this. I think we learned a lot. And this one here is another one of the points that I had, the terminated projects, and I really just want to flesh it out. You correctly identified, I think it might actually be 56 projects. Additionally, it is by and large most of the time because of landowner issues, and the lack of interest really comes into play when it has taken us too long to come to terms to get through that property phase, so that they don't even care what the appraised price is, or they just moved on with what they want to do with the property. That's the lack of interest, because the projects that you see that we include into the annual report does not include all projects that we look at, but we've gotten them to some point, at least at that end of year snapshot, where we have an intention that we feel like that's a site where mitigation, appropriate mitigation could occur, and we're assessing the site in further terms with our staff or with a consultant to get towards that conceptual plan approved, create the conceptual plan, get that approved by IT. So those are the only projects you see, and of those is where that 55 didn't make it through that phase, and the reason being that really the property caused or just a change of mind for the landowner. A lot of times they're not willing to accept the appraised price, and as you mentioned correctly, the mineral. So But I will say from my standpoint, it's also, and you said this sort of similarly, but I don't think having terminated projects is necessarily a negative thing, because it's a measure. You're kind of showing the level of effort, that we're not just sitting around doing nothing. And so there's this going out and looking for projects and finding worthy projects to get them onto this list in the first place. I'd say for every project that gets on the list, we probably looked at 5 to 10 that don't. And so the big thing though that I want to resolve, and that's that last bullet, unclear about the expenditures. None of the terminated projects take away from available project funds. We utilize administrative funds by our staff time, and those portions of consultant contracts, because that's essentially an extension of our staff, those don't even dip into project funds. Now, there's some rare occasions, like I think you pointed out in the report, where there is a big expenditure. Like I think it was Punching Creek was really high, and that was an old project, and there were several reasons why that one didn't proceed, and ultimately, I think the landowner, basically it was a family, and the patriarch of the family passed away, and their interest, that's not an excuse, that's just what happened. So, we moved on from there. But even in that case where we had gotten into the design phase, we're able to absorb those basically costs of doing business with the admin and reserve funds. So there's not a situation that I'm aware of where we've started a project and officially terminated it, and that cost mitigation from occurring. So that just to clear that up. And I'm not exactly sure how to report that. But that's just procedure.
Okay, so let me comment just a little bit on that. So we do have to be careful about terminated projects, and I think it is, just like I said earlier, we want to be careful about not creating incentives for you to keep projects going that are not viable projects, right? So that's part of my concern about saying, kind of caveating that, hey, look, the fact that terminated projects are occurring are not necessarily a bad thing, because if it's a bad project or a project that can't move forward for whatever reason, we don't want it to keep moving forward. It needs to be ended when it becomes obvious that, it's not going to work. So that's important. But I do think, we have to be concerned about terminated projects and why they're not moving forward, because there is a lot of information. So if you're spending a lot of time, regardless of whether the funds are coming from project funds or from administrative funds, it is taking resources. And those are resources that, could be used for other things. Even if it's allocated to your administrative bucket, it is still accumulating resources. So, if we are seeing a lot of terminated projects, and it is a signal that, maybe we need to think about why we're having these problems. And it does seem like, the land issues are the real reason. So, we just want to be careful how we interpret terminated projects.
Certainly. I think, a big portion of what we're tasked with doing is finding, identifying, and developing projects. So it stands to reason that not every project you find will become a successful project. That is the process. So I don't think 32%, like 1 in 3 that we find that becomes, appears to be at that beginning stage, in those beginning stages of what could be a viable mitigation site, that's probably not. I have no idea what other states do. I have no idea what the mitigation banking process is. But I know that, having done it in the private sector before, it's not easy to find good mitigation sites. and our staff are generally pretty good about it. And we have a pretty good process. I think I do understand what you're saying about we have to be concerned we're not, misusing resources, whether they're admin or reserve or whatever. But again, one of the primary purposes is to find and identify sites. So in order to find one, you may lose one. So you got to go through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really where, again, I go back to the recommendation where a more thorough analysis with significant resources could help with this, because you're absolutely right. I mean, it's like, when I listen to Coach Cal after a basketball game, he's talking about, you got to shoot some shots, put
Right.
it up there. You're going to miss on some of these. I think benchmarking to other states is really informative. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to achieve what other states are doing, but you need to understand kind of how you're performing relative to them. And if there are differences, why are there differences, right? I mean, things may just be different in Kentucky for whatever reason. It could be, the legal requirements that we have here, could be any number of things. But I think it is helpful to think about what our success rate is relative to other states. And not necessarily that we have to be doing exactly the same level that other states are, but to understand what those differences are and why, and whether they're acceptable or unacceptable and need change.
Is that something when you looked at other states that there was information about?
I think you can get it, but it's not easily accessible. You'd have to go to each state. Each state seems to report these things differently. I think you could do that. I think, if somebody reached out to you and said, can you provide me a list of the projects that you've provided and important dates in terms of when they moved across different phases of the project, you'd probably be able to do that. It takes some work, but if you could go through and you could request that type of thing from other states, then you'd be able to provide comparable metrics to what we did here.
But nothing in the annual reports.
Yeah, I don't look at their singular.
But nothing was contained in their annual reports similar to this.
I'm sorry, Scott, what was that?
I was saying, but there, did you see any annual reports from other states that contained this kind of information?
We didn't collect the annual reports from all the other states.
Oh, okay.
I do recall us getting some reports from North Carolina. I don't know if they're the reports that they provide to the Corps, because I kind of think that you all would probably be providing similar reports to the Corps, but I could be wrong on that. But the reports that I saw did not provide project lists that I recall, but I'm getting older. My memory may be incorrect.
I mean, humorously, don't get me wrong, it kind of begs the question, if we didn't call it out, would anybody care? Maybe we should stop reporting it.
I wouldn't encourage that. No, I do think it's great information. I know in at least one of your annual reports, you provided these reasons. And I thought that was great. I thought that was really informative.
I mean,
it really does, help us understand where you have had problems meeting these obligations. And it sounds like you all have used this to identify the problem and make some changes. And the question now is, since we understand that going forward, will these changes actually materially affect progress?
Right.
And hopefully they will.
And I think we're going to have a good idea of that on February 11th when the bids for the RFP that we have out in the Upper Cumberland come in, because it's going to be interesting to see what kind of submittals are in, and whether, because that area is heavily inundated with mineral issues, and we're going to see, as a comparison and contrast, whether the private sector encounters the same type of issues that we do, especially east of I-75 in coal country.
Yeah. I think you know, as far as that's probably a pretty good cross section, even though it wasn't always reported the reasons. Those are the standout reasons that I would have, you know, off the top of my head said. And I think our ability to move property faster will address to some extent the lack of interest. And in some cases where we have trouble, the ability to do full delivery projects, even the ones we have now, could go a long way to help minimize the effects of like land prices and even to a smaller extent, maybe even the mineral rights problems. So I think, yeah, I mean, we're definitely heading in the right direction. So, but anyway, I really wanted to point it out because I think it's worth noting, but then also that we don't take away from project funds is really the big message I want to make sure that it does not limit us from meeting mitigation obligations, with the caveat that if we were unable to identify other projects and we lose the one that we have, that obviously would contribute to not meeting mitigation obligations.
And because it's administrative funds, it stays in that silo. You're not reallocating it from project A to project B once project A falls apart.
Yeah. Looks like we might have a question. Tim.
Hey, Rob. Hey, Professor Clark. Hey, just to clarify some things on North Carolina's level, for those that don't know, I most recently ran the North Carolina program for several years. The North Carolina annual report satisfies two requirements, the Corps of Engineers requirement, as well as a statutory requirement by the North Carolina General Assembly. So the information therein basically meets those two definitions for request. And I'll say too, as far as terminated projects in North Carolina, we suffered a great deal of some of the same things Kentucky's doing, having to deal with terminated projects while we were doing a lot of design bid build work. When we transferred over to full delivery procurement processes, a lot of that went away because it was reliant upon the private mitigation providers to find the sites, deliver the sites, and those failures were, I say failures, those, you know, projects that may have been quote unquote terminated were more related to private mitigation providers not being able to, you know, develop the site, you know, some of the same maybe landowner issues that existed, but the program did not take on the obligation of those sites early on or with the private providers. So that's maybe one difference that you may see from, you know, where North Carolina came from with some of the procurement strategy. And I will say this too, Ribbits is a very poor source of information for any of this. So I just want to clarify that and make sure that was said.
Yeah, we've been a bit frustrated with Ribbits.
I don't want to dog on Ribbits, but I was trying to figure some stuff out this morning and I had to just give up, but that may come up again later. But anyway, let's go ahead and roll on forward with it. I had at least one more question. Yeah, this is fine. I guess while you're on here, Tim, could you speak to the North Carolina releases being ahead of the sales?
Yeah. Reason the North Carolina program was set up the way it is that our Department of Transportation needed to develop credits in advance of impacts. And 85% of the North Carolina Mitigation Services business is the North Carolina DOT. They provide impacts 7 years in advance, or what projected impacts 7 years in advance to DMS. And then Mitigation Services goes and procures that mitigation. Thus, you see what you've termed here as a credit release or a release ahead of impacts that looks substantially high, because a lot of those impacts are projected impacts and not necessarily permit delivered to associate with a credit at that point in time. So that's one reason it looks a little bit funky related to other states. But I will say one benefit that the program has had is to be able to do that development of credits in advance of impacts, which, puts it in a category that, very similar to, honestly, banks, and when they're developing credits, as impacts are happening or prior to happening. So, but DMS is not a bank by no means.
Right, but you do have that sort of you have a capital investment in advance of actually dealing with the impacts in a sense.
Well in advance of permitted impact, correct?
Right. So I think that in that sense, it makes North Carolina an outlier from a comparison standpoint, because you're actually functioning a little bit differently. But I will also add that kind of unintended consequences of Kentucky's being slow and having accrued sort of a large reserve fund is that in some areas, we're going to be able, as we develop the projects we've already identified and started their approval processes, the ability to have sort of on-the-shelf mitigation sites. I don't know that we would actually go so far as to be able to release credits in advance, but certainly we could cut out the entire property phase for getting to the point where we can get further down the road on a project a lot closer in conjunction with impact. So there's a few service areas where we have that scenario, and anytime we can take advantage of the reserve funds to kind of similarly, kind of bolster that initial capital investment into a project where we're trying to make it happen. Like, we're trying to stretch that reserve fund as widely across the program as we can for that purpose, without taking away from its base function. But so it is still limited, but again, that's something that we're in the process of kind of growing towards. So I think that's good. Continue ahead.
Hey, Rob, one question, just while we're on the discussion of release of credits.
Sure.
Does North Carolina, is the release of credits sooner than what Kentucky is? Because I know a lot of the release of credits with Kentucky is all in the monitoring phase. Are we comparing apples to apples there?
You talking about the actual schedule that's prescribed for any given project?
Yes.
I don't know. Tim might know. I don't know.
It's probably very similar, George. If I'm remembering correctly, it's 30% of as-built and then release during monitoring, over 7 years of monitoring. So I'm assuming it's probably very similar to FILO.
Yeah, ours is actually pretty slow. Ours might be 20% of as-built. But I think we have a 10 or 15 at mitigation plan approval and site protection instrument execution, kind of a pre-construction amount. Yeah, and I think that's right. That approval is, that's referring to, that's why I wasn't sure. One of our release milestones is as-built, which is the immediately post-construction. And then what you have written as easement obtained may also be the approval. The approval may be a part of that. But anyway, it's in the 20% range. But we have a big 20% at the end as well. So that to date, that's pretty close to what all ours did. We keep going.
Can you go back one, Dr. Clark? There you go. In regard to the last bullet, where it says it might also shift, a lack of FILO credits could and it says, but might also shift developers to mitigation banks if they are available. Under the federal hierarchy, if mitigation banks are available, that's the first option for developers.
Yeah.
So the lack of credits not being available, that's kind of, I won't say it's incorrect, but it's kind of, if mitigation banks are available, they're the first option, regardless of whether credits are available or not.
Okay, so I think then what that would suggest is that it's more likely that selling out of credits in an area will have a constraint on economic impact or economic growth then.
But it depends,
Not if banks are available.
right?
Well, that's my point though. If they've basically come to you and would normally come to you because banks are available and you've sold out, and because, you know, they've come to you because banks aren't available and you've sold out, then that suggests there's a constraint.
Well, I think
Except they still have the option to do permitting responsible mitigation.
they do.
Yes, absolutely. Sure.
I mean, there's
But the
kind of a
idea
lot
is,
going on.
if this is not an option, then they're going to look for whatever mechanism they can use. If they can do it themselves, they would do that. Presumably they don't, because, you know, that's maybe more expensive. So it increased development cost. If they have to, you know, try to find, you know, what little mitigation bank might be available, or, you know, maybe kind of appeal to the market, then, you know, that could potentially drive prices, I think. So if you've sold out of credits because, you know, people have gone to the mitigation banks, there's no credits available from the mitigation banks, they've exhausted yours, then it would suggest, based on that hierarchy, then there's not a whole lot of options they have other than do it themselves.
Well,
Presumably,
you know, except for the fact that mitigation banks don't have an allocated cap, there can be multiple mitigation banks in an area that have an unlimited amount of credits.
Yeah.
So,
There's a little more to unpack there, but I think it's kind of a complicated thing. Like if a given service area, and Catherine spoke to this before, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, but within a given service area, if there's a sort of a good enough market for a mitigation bank to be profitable, then they'll come and be profitable. If that, we don't have that in all our service areas in Kentucky. And if you looked at like from the top down on these histograms as far as sales, like it's a tiny amount. And when it's large, it's only sporadically large. So you don't have this steady market of need everywhere. So we have a really weird mixture of viable service areas for mitigation banks, you know, of their own volition. And then, you know, in those situations, FILO is there when the mitigation banks don't have release credits available. But for the most part, most of the areas are less viable for mitigation banks. And so FILO, so they're not even there at all. And it's, the way you've written it there, it kind of suggested to me when I first read it was like, well, if FILO's gone, then the mitigation banks will come in. But I don't know that we could assume that, because maybe it's just not a viable service area for banks.
because
what it would seem to do is put pressure on the credits, right? I mean, you've got a lot of people basically, well, developers are looking to find credits. If they can't find it through you, then they might be willing to pay a higher price to a mitigation bank.
they don't have that.
Maybe that is sufficient to allow a mitigation bank to perform. Maybe that's sufficient enough to induce them to start developing a mitigation bank. Maybe not. I think what it sounds like you're telling me is, if that's not an option, if that's not a viable market, you know, at any price, then selling out of credits could potentially have this constraining impact. Now, I think, you know, we could probably come up with a lot of different scenarios to describe where maybe it wouldn't, maybe it would. Yeah. Ultimately, though, I think this is really an empirical question in terms of, do we see maybe development not being able to go forward because they're unable to get permits? That's a much more complicated question. We don't have data on that.
We don't, but what we do have is, like I said, looking at that histogram from the top down, the very slow trickle of sales over time, even in the Salt River, like it took 10 years to sell half the credits. So perceivably, and that's one of the more active areas. So
10 years in a major LG&E development.
right, and so maybe we got another 10 years left with ongoing projects, as we may see later. So is it limiting? You know, the answer is always going to be it depends, but you know, because of the large amount of advanced credits that the FILO program has, it's unlikely, except in Northern Kentucky where we saw it happen, it's unlikely that there'll be a lot of limitations as a result of lack of FILO credits.
Which is recognized in the first bullet.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm down with this. I don't
Yeah.
have an issue with it. I just, the relationship of banks and the NLUFI program, it's kind of a funny one, because they're distinct and they operate in importantly distinct ways that, you know, it kind of gives it kind of an odd nuance. So it's definitely, yeah. Catherine?
Great discussion. Thanks everyone so much. I agree with everything that was just described about sort of the dynamic between banks and FILO. And, you know, ideally we all want FILO to continue to have credits in every watershed. My question is just a quick clarification on this slide. Rob, correct me, but I think there are 0 credits available in the Big and Little Sandy right now as well. Is that correct?
There's 0 for sale. That is correct. But we technically have an advanced credit allotment. We're just not selling because we don't have projects for them.
Okay, so thanks for that clarification. So technically there are 200,000? That doesn't sound right.
Probably right. Yeah.
Yeah. So technically they're in your inventory, but they're not available to permittees.
Correct.
As a result of, you all want to wait until you have more released credits in order to open those advanced credits back up for sale?
That's a good point. Because of the issue with property and mineral and Big Sandy, there's a huge portion of that area that really is not viable for mitigation projects unless you just happen to, stumble upon the unicorn that, so about half that area is extraordinarily difficult. But anyway, because of that, the model of selling credits, prior to even identifying a site isn't a viable model as an NLUFI program. We would we're fine with that everywhere else because we've been able to identify projects. Follow through is an issue, which we're talking about, but identifying isn't. But in Big Sandy, where that identifying is difficult, our operational model would be something more like when we identify a project that we agree is viable, or we get to a point of knowing it's viable because we've done a title review or whatever, we've done some small portion of feasibility determination, then we will sell an amount of credits relative to that project in particular as we find them. So there's a little bit different order operations for how I think we would perceive if we were to start selling credits in Big Sandy again. And that would be limited by finding that next project that isn't tied to old credits we already sold.
Got it. Okay, thanks for the clarification.
And I think there's some other NLUFI programs that operate that way in general, not just as a sort of a problem solving measure like I described for us, but in some cases, I think maybe the Northern Kentucky program may identify projects before they sell credits. But I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't know that for a fact 100%. But anyway, I think we're good on this one. Dr. Clark, we can keep rolling forward. I don't think I had any issue with this.
Dr. Clark, I have one question, and that's in regard to the 7 to 9 jobs. My question is that new jobs created, or if you contract with a large company that has an existing staff, exactly how do you come to that figure? Is it job creation or job support?
It's job supported.
Okay.
Now,
So it's not
I mean,
necessarily new jobs, it's just it could be the use, it could encompass the use of existing staff.
right, or the shift of where the labor actually occurs.
Okay.
Now, it could potentially translate to new jobs, particularly if it's persistent. And, there's kind of a tight labor market, which of course we have now. And in other years, we might have low construction activity. And so it would just be helping to fund some of the workers that actually are already employed. So it's probably best to think about it as these are jobs and income that are supported by the mitigation activity.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good clarification. That's the difference.
That's a good point.
Support. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's roll.
I'm good.
Next, we covered a lot of this.
Yeah.
I think I might be through most of my comments.
You want to move on to your spreadsheet?
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, does anybody else have any comments for Dr. Clark while we're still in his set of slides here? I don't see any hands. One thing I will point out as we're moving, and this is sort of my segue, is you had tables, I think 6 and 7 in the report, which you didn't get deeply into here, but it's, kind of the credits sold versus credits released. And there's a pretty good gap there. And I'm gonna, when I get into, our data on project status, I hope to kind of address that a little bit. So I don't know if you have those handy or if what I have, if it's meaningful, but I'm attempting to try to address that issue that point's very clearly made in the report. So I want to be mindful of it.
Do you want me to pull those tables up?
Well, let's see if mine will kind of.
Yeah, go ahead.
And if it doesn't do a good enough job for everybody, then I'm certainly happy to switch to something better. Hang on, I'm just trying to get the spreadsheet opened up here before I share my screen. All right. So it's nice and huge for me, but you guys let me know if we want to zoom in. It's a really involved spreadsheet. So I'm going to describe it to us. And is it coming through?
Anyone?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay. So, so I know it looks like a lot, but it's all packed into one. And once I'm going to just tell you about just the navigation of it, and then we can zoom in if you can't read it as it is. So the first portion, we move left to right, top to bottom, starting with streams on top are blue, wetlands are green, just working through all the service areas as each row. The first 5 columns are about credit sales and release status, like cumulatively by service area, not individual projects. So as you can see, kind of what I was getting at is the release credits is a very different number from the cumulative sold credits. And that lines up with the histogram we saw Dr. Clark present. So I guess kind of the numbers that inform the histogram, basically. And my numbers may be slightly different than yours in an area or two. We may have one more, like more recent credit release, but it's not large, so I don't think it would change really what your history, the point your histogram made. The way this is set up is the obligation, credit obligation means we got work to do. You know, there's credits we need to fulfill. We've made a sale. And so that's it. To make the point, those show up as a negative number in this sheet. Kind of help highlight it's not a negative thing, but it's something that we got to do. The goal being to get this back to zero, or to move column G into release credits, column F, such that we replenish the initial advance credits back up to as close to the original amount as possible. And that's sort of the revolving, not fund, but just the circle of life, I guess, for in lieu fee credits. So moving to the middle of the sheet, and I got this sort of a gradient of colors identifying these columns. And basically these are the projects added up and put into these categories, color coded, with more complete being toward the left and less complete being toward the right. And by complete, I mean, how far are we through the project process? For example, this says credits constructed. These are not yet constructed, but we have a permit and SPI. So that's a big credit milestone, a credit release milestone, for example, but also a significant transition from design phase to construction phase. Another big milestone here is we have a conceptual plan approval, not a mitigation plan approval. Those are distinct. We have conceptual plan approval and a land contract, or we've already executed the SPI, maybe we already own the property, whatever. This is important. This is not a credit release milestone, but this is significant because it's at this point where we will enter into significant contracts with regard to design phase. We may have already begun the contracts because we had other elements like surveying, site finding, conceptual plan development, feasibility studies, things like that may have already been going on. So the contract may have already been there, but the size of those contracts is significantly different before this point, smaller, I should say, before this point than it is after that. And at this point also, I wouldn't explicitly say it's absolutely a point of no return, but certainly if you go back after this, then you will have expended some funds that you need to seriously account for, like that punching project that I mentioned, that we got to this phase, it still fell through, but that is not common.
But once the land is acquired, we've burned the boats on the beach. We're going forward.
Yeah, that in the case where we have the SPI executed, then we are proceeding, period. Now, this column is CP approval, but no land option or SPI. So that's an important step from a standpoint of committing funds and allocations as far as internal and planning. So that's a very important step, but we still haven't expended a lot of funds, mostly internal and certainly all administrative. This step right here is under development. So we've identified a project, or not if it's a zero, but if there's a number, it means we've identified a project or have some procurement process associated with credits or a project that's underway, and the expectation is that there'll be a fulfillment associated with the number here. But this is, most of our terminated projects, if you will, that we talked about earlier would fall in these two categories. The bulk of those in this category. But we do try to run the development of conceptual plan approval with regulatory agencies and IRT concurrently as much as we can with property activity, unless there's some sort of doubts or a special scenario that we want to make sure we've crossed T's and dotted I's with regulatory agencies before dipping too deeply into the property, or vice versa. So a little bit of a balancing act. The big distinction here being this is conceptual plan approval. So this is, you know, kind of the rubber meets the road here, I guess. This is just the totals of everything in the first 4 columns. And then this is the remaining credit obligation after we implement these projects. And this one is the remaining credit obligation for all phases of identified projects. And then lastly, I inserted in here because one thing we really haven't delved deeply into at all is 3-year compliance, which is our regulatory metric for have we identified viable sites and are we progressing towards those? It's truly, that's what's written in the rule. When we, you know, all the discussion that Dr. Clark looked at and what we generally think about in terms of the work group and, you know, what are our obligations, we sort of glaze over this and don't really think about it, but this is the compliance metric. So in 22, for example, at the end of this year, we're really only responsible from a compliance standpoint of identifying and developing projects associated with sales as of the end of 2019. So that's a little bit different number, but you can see it makes a difference in some scenarios. Like, for example, there was a lot of sales in the lower or upper Kentucky since 2019, such that with existing projects identified, we go from having an obligation to meet to we're in good shape right now. But at the end of this year, maybe, or the end of the year after this number goes up. So it's kind of an odd nuance to deal with, but you know, that's just the world we live in. That's what in lieu fee programs have to deal with. So I just want to put this in here. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it does affect what you would call being in compliance or not, or things of that nature. So just to give you the lay of the land with this spreadsheet, is it too small for you to see? Would you like me to zoom in and go through it a little bit more detail, or can everybody see it like this? So please let me know if you cannot read it. Okay.
I can barely read it, Rob.
Okay.
Would you be able to email it to us?
I definitely can. And after, okay, you know, all the materials that you've seen today, I'll try to distribute. I haven't asked him for it yet, but Dr. Clark, if you're willing to share maybe a PDF of your presentation, I can distribute that to the members. But yeah, so I'll zoom in, kind of start here, and we'll work our way across. So let's see.
And by the way, Rob, this is just terrific. Really appreciate your taking the time to put this together. It's hugely illuminating and clarifying. I have a question about column L.
Okay.
Where you know, you guys have described that for completely understandable reasons, land acquisition can sometimes be a limiting factor or difficult, or there's minerals or whatever, or it takes time, as Dr. Clark's data showed. Where you have column, I think it's N as in Nancy, no, sorry, column O, where you've summed the first 4 columns. I guess my question is, what would be the effect? How would the picture look different if you summed the first 3 columns? Does that make sense? In other words, or maybe you could help us understand how you think about column L. If you don't have land control, how how certain or not certain, or what kind of a risk weighting do you put on those credits? There's a lot of credits in column L.
Yes.
How do you think about those and whether or not they will actually come to be if you can't get land control? And therefore, how does that shift the picture of your remaining obligations?
That's a really good question, and part of the reason for kind of pulling it out, because the timing of conceptual plan approval is pretty static. Like, we're pretty good about, the 2, 3, 4 months of us producing, getting it to the agencies, communicating them the project and everything. That is a fairly good and predictable turnaround. It rarely gets, blasted out beyond that. But getting that land option is not easy. You may get all kinds of verbal commitments from a landowner, but still there's title things to resolve, or at least to determine what there is or is not to resolve. For example, a project right here, this one in Big Sandy. This isn't typical, but I just happen to know that that is one project. I'm pretty sure the bulk of that is one project, and it has title issues that aren't just mineral. They're also related to some sort of funkiness and some transfers that cloud the title a little bit, maybe some airship issues. So there's a portion of this that's less likely that we would be able to proceed. But we don't have to do anything with that project. All we have to do is, we got a conceptual plan approval. We're not going to spend any more time or money on them, but we can go to that landowner and say, look, we did the title opinion. We're going to put this on the back burner. If you want to resolve these, we're good to go. So in that case, there's a portion of this number that's not incredibly likely, but we're a willing buyer and they were a willing seller if they want to, figure out the resolution. Now there's others that are just the opposite. Like there's no obstruction to proceeding. It just so happens that we've completed our conceptual plan approval and we haven't gotten to the point of having the land contract in place. So to answer your question is the spectrum of how likely or unlikely is as wide as you can imagine. So I would have to go in and piece out each project that comes up with these. And that's part of what we do, kind of the business of deciding what projects are next, is to decide, okay, well, how badly do we need the project that makes up these? In some cases, it's multiple projects. Does this get us one ahead? Does this get us, beyond our 3-year obligation, beyond our current obligation, or do we not even need it? In some cases, we may not need this project, but we've got a conceptual plan approved. And so, as long as the landowner's like, well, I don't need to sell tomorrow, I can hang out for a while. I mean, I think that's the case with one in the lower Kentucky. This one, I think it's this one. We didn't do the conceptual plan, but there's nothing stopping us from doing the conceptual plan. So it'd be very easy to move this one to this column, but the landowner's like, yeah, one of these days I'm going to want to get rid of this and I want to sell it to you guys if you can buy it, So there's a lot of nuance there. So it would be, in order to break this down further, which I think is what you're getting at, I would need to delineate these projects by some sort of metric of probability or prioritization. But at this point, it isn't necessary to do that. But if we had other sort of guidance or intents or purposes, then maybe it would become more necessary. I think what this is just telling you is where we are. So
yeah,
no. All right.
Yeah, no, I was just looking for that color or that background that you just provided, Rob. I'm not suggesting you do more work and further refine it. But I understand what you're saying about the status of the land control could be, anywhere. Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to do the math here real quick. It does change the picture a bit. Let's just assume worst case scenario, right? That none of the land, you're not able to get land control for any of the projects, right? Which is not necessarily realistic, but let's just use it as one benchmark.
Sure.
Then you would have some more negative numbers in column O than you do now, but they wouldn't all go negative by any means. That's anyways, this was a helpful description of kind of how you guys think through the land control piece.
Yeah.
And as the private sector, we're always trying to think, how can we be a complementary help here, right? And one of the ways is, we can get land control. So that's why I was asking about that column.
I think opening up, like we've talked about, the full delivery procurement would allow us, potentially, I don't know for sure how it would go, but there's a scenario of that procurement development that maybe it would allow us to say, well, we couldn't get there. Well, this is a great mitigation site. Maybe it's got an endangered species or fish or something, something of concern on it. Or maybe it's something is about it makes that project worth trying harder. Then, maybe we could solicit a full delivery and target this area of target this area of the service area within and say, let's look for projects there. Rather than just saying, hey, full delivery for Upper Cumberland, we'll say, hey, let's do full delivery for Whitley County, or Whitley and surrounding counties or something like that. And I think having these projects and knowing like where do we go from, oh, we got a Terminated project, or this project is fine, but there's something going on that's going to keep us from proceeding in a timely manner. Then we have to make a business decision. Basically, it's like, okay, do we cut and run? Do we try to procure it differently? But we need those options in order to make those decisions. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about is how do we expand that option so that we can more efficiently or more, I guess, productively, ultimately, kick these forward, basically. But once you get past this, once you get into this phase right here, you pretty well, it's not set and forget it by any means, but you're going to get to the end.
Yeah. Yep. No, that makes total sense. Yep.
And that's one of the reasons we believe that streamlining or creating an avenue, giving us flexibility for full delivery on property we don't own, that even if we end up with a conservation easement down the line, that is an incredible tool to add to our toolbox in order to move this forward.
So, but I mean, I think you're right. I think it would be maybe this one, it would significantly affect out of all these. So yeah, I mean, but so seeing this, just real quick though, just kind of bring everybody, make sure everybody's on the same page with us. I think this is fairly straightforward. I mean, I could have calculated this where it wasn't necessarily a negative number, but Catherine, I think that's the way we had talked about it originally, and it helps it stand out. So, I mean, that's good. To address the issue and kind of bring forward some issues that we have mentioned already in you know, before today, and also maybe more detail in Dr. Clark's presentation, there's a big concern about the gap between this number and this number, basically, which is this. And this is what's filling that gap. So, you know, moving these projects forward moves this number effectively, especially, you know, like this is a credit release step, essentially. And so is this, you know, as long as you're getting that as well, that directly moves these out of here into here. So, and you can see we've got this huge, we go from a lot of zeros in this column to a lot of numbers in this column, and a lot of numbers following this column up. And essentially what you're seeing is the effect of what Scott mentioned earlier, where we spent 4 years with basically no progress implementing SPI. And before that, it wasn't a smooth process ever, to a significant increase in our ability to execute SPI. So that all of a sudden, you know, the lots of zeros and lots of straggling becomes a lots of productivity. And that's where you're seeing it, like right now. This is that rubber meeting the road, and that, you know, projects, we have more projects with SPI than we do that we're just hoping happen, you know, basically, which, you know, if you've taken this same snapshot 3 years ago, all these numbers would have been over here. You know, there's been some new projects found in the past 3 years for sure, but none of these were sitting here. I can assure you that. So anyway, that's kind of to identify an issue, but also illuminate that there's been substantial progress that's just on the horizon. Like we're basically seeing a wave of credit release come forward. And I'm not saying that's going to catch us up entirely in the short term, because the other issue that we have is with, and there's nothing we can do about it, and it's not necessarily bad, but it confuses lots and lots of people, and this is where in lieu fee programs are distinct in the way that they're viewed, you know, when you look at the numbers, is from banks, that is it's a lot simpler for a bank, because you create your credits and you sell them, and they're kind of gone. Because if you want to sell more credits, you may have to find a new site. If you've sold all, you know, if you've met your capacity at a site, you're done, you know, and they're gone. So you kind of forget about those, you go make new ones. Where we have this replenishment cycle that we have to deal with, it's also limited by the credit release schedule. So, you know, there may be this number 13,320 right here in this column. You know, maybe we could get 15% of this released when it gets into this column. 15% of 13,320 will go in there, not 13,320. Then, you know, we go do construction, and 2 years later, when construction is over, we get another 5% of this 13,320 goes into here. And then the following year, maybe it's you know, I don't know, say we do, I can't remember the regular monitoring, maybe it's 12.5 or some odd number, but another 12.5 of 13,320 from this project goes into here. But we're 3 years down the line already. So that 13,320 is a commitment we have to make now and have funds to afford it now. But it's going to take a decade to get all that 13,320 into this column. And so I think that nuance, it creates a lot of confusion when people look at an in lieu fee program and be like, well, golly, your credit releases are so much lower than your obligation. Well, it's because I can build this obligation up instantaneously with a credit sale. But for every one credit, that we sell, it takes 10 plus years to put all of that one credit back into this bucket. And that's just how it is. I mean, there's really no way around it, but it causes a lot of confusion for people that look at it like, well, we need to look how low this is. You're not doing enough. So anyway, I just want to kind of dispel that if you want to think about progress in terms of an in lieu fee project, you really got to look at it this way and think of those project stages and milestones from the capacity of a project, not the release of credits from a project. Now, that's not to say that it's an excuse and we're not trying, but that's also why you see like a big number here. It's because it takes so long to put them back into the bucket. You can't, it's very difficult to get that, to make up that lag. And so there's always going to be something there. So I know we're way down in the weeds, everybody, and I hate to drag us all through that. Maybe not for the first time even, but I think it's important to see. And then from a standpoint of, what do we take away from this on the back end? What do we have available to go do projects? You know what I'm saying? Like what new projects do we need to do? If we've identified projects and looking at it from the opposite perspective, let's be optimistic. Let's say all these projects are going to, they have no issues. They're going to just work their way on through the system and get the SPIs and go, then, we're ahead. And a positive number here means we don't have funds to actually complete or implement all this, so we got to think about, okay, well, can I divide these projects up into smaller projects to just utilize the funding I have? Where do I have funding and where can I spend it? Like this one project or this one service area, looking at all sales to date, translates into about, let's see, what's the note? $6.35 million in project funds that we don't have. Not that we don't have a project identified, but we don't have it far enough along that it's, like you can see right there, that big number. That's why that's a big number. So we're behind schedule, basically, ignoring the 3-year rule. So maybe we could go do a full delivery for $6 million, for example, to help you caught up. And if we had no projects identified here, then that's exactly what we would be talking about doing. Maybe we would have already done, is to say, well, we don't have projects identified and we're getting down to due date. Well, let's get a solicitation out there. Let's throw that out there for the vendors, the mitigation providers, and they'll help us get caught up. Similarly, because it's a little more bleak for wetlands, because those are just far slower sales and far more difficult to find good mitigation sites. That's exactly where we are in at least these 2 service areas and behind our compliance goals in these 5, right now today. So, then we need to be talking about, okay, well, we don't have, like I said, if this column has a 0 in it and this is a negative number, all right, well, this is when we need to do a full delivery. We need to talk about, doing something out in front. But here's the problem that I want mitigation providers to understand. This past due obligation is $150,000. That's not a huge project. And that's not, that's how many project funds are sitting there. The largest one, being the Lower Cumberland, of course, it's not a 0 in that column now. So then we're looking at, okay, do we make a business decision? How good is this project? Basically what you were saying, Catherine, is like, how likely is this to go forth? you know, we still have some unanswered questions. Obviously, we don't even have a conceptual plan approval, but, you know, we may turn that in tomorrow. Title and stuff like that is ongoing, you know, so once we find the answers to those questions, that's going to tell us, all right, do we get this, do we get to move it into this column? And how rapidly can we get it into this column and articulate that to the regulatory agencies and say, look, we know we're behind, but you just looked at this project and everybody agreed it's a great project, let's go do it. Or, you know, under their guidance, do they say, let's see if we can find something better. That ain't that great of a project. We could do full delivery, or they can direct us to go purchase credits from a bank if one exists. And we're, you know, that's the options on the table, and that's totally viable. And
that's one of the things that, looking at these columns, what led to the RFP going out, even though when it was initially offered, there was some review or some comments that it wasn't a significant RFP, but what it was doing is seeking to obtain our full allotment of wetland credits in the amount we needed. And I think in talking to Tim as well, even if we go forward with full delivery, a lot of the project, there'll be a lot more smaller scale projects as opposed to the larger scale projects.
yeah, especially on the wetland side. Because we just don't have the pace of sales that would build up funds for a large project. You know, we will be augmenting to make them more viable through the reserve funding, like I mentioned before, but that only goes so far, and you certainly don't want to do that irresponsibly. So anyway, this is kind of giving you guys a much deeper dive into the thought process from a status standpoint, and you know what we work through, and I hope highlighting how having the option to do a full delivery project to keep us from getting to this point would be stellar for us. And maybe we do them on the front end, or you know, or in some bigger periodic, faster rate of doing those. But essentially, that's the status of the projects we have. Now, one last thing I want to mention, and again, happy for all kinds of discussion and questions, is when somebody, you know, people identify the balance, the $150 million balance, and we say, well, those are, we have projects allocated to those. It's just part of the system. You know, we're not spending the dollars because we're not far enough through the project. That's where these dollars are assigned. These are the allocations for that. Now, not all of these, but certainly all of these.
Which is why we're at 85% allocation.
Right.
Actually, I think it's 87.
Yeah. And so that's why, you know, this is what we look at to be like, oh, what do we have left to go do? So, I mean, I hope this is helpful. And again, I'll PDF it and email it to membership. But I really, really would welcome any sort of questions and comments that you guys have. Because I think definitely don't feel like a question can be a stupid question, because that's really not possible. Because I mean, this is a tangled web here. Help us out of it.
And this is the type of information that I think Dr. Clark was implying, or not implying, I don't mean that connotation, but I think Dr. Clark's report was kind of getting at that the type of information that could be made publicly available, going above and beyond what is required to be put in an annual report. I think going forward, this is the type of information that can be helpful. And as Dr. Clark being a college professor, this might get us from that B to that A- level.
Now, I guess that's a good notion. Maybe a good question directly for you, Dr. Clark, is do you have comments with regard to the work you did and seeing this in this manner? I don't think it changes anything you did. Certainly a 2020 annual report may provide some updates, but is this helpful?
I think it is helpful. I mean, first, I want to kind of note that this is pretty dense, and it would take me a while to really fully wrap my mind around what exactly they're telling me here and determine whether or not I see the story that you're telling. But I think it is an important story. I mean, for one, what we looked at was the release. And I agree that you're absolutely correct that what we're seeing released is only a partial demonstration of the work that the agency is doing. Right? It doesn't provide the complete background of what you all are doing. It doesn't provide a complete measure of that. It is useful, though, looking at the releases to show what's going on across other states, assuming we actually have good data, and it seems like Rivets has got some issues. But yes, I think some of this information, a little bit more background about how to interpret it correctly, is useful.
Good.
I think what we're really trying to address, I mean, all that really, but is important to me to address is we've gotten a lot of backlash about the balance, the $150 million balance, basically. And it's probably more than 150. I'm just saying 150 because it's in that range. I don't know what it is, but we can't just go spending that money, because then that undermines our ability to make decisions and do these projects.
And there has to be a recognition that allocated funds have a significant restriction, and that even though the balance does say in excess of 150, and the reality of it is the amount of funding available is anywhere between $7 and $11 million.
So
I think there were two hands somewhere.
yeah, I want to make sure I'm giving everybody a chance here. So if anybody's got some ideas or thoughts, or just want to scream at us.
Because we're getting late into the process.
We've only got about 12, 15 more minutes. And there's a couple things I know we want to mention, but it definitely ties back to this. So,
Hey, Rob, this is George.
yeah.
One thing I want to point out, or I guess I want to ask is, I agree full deliveries are a great tool in the toolbox, and I think it's great if you guys could have access to that. But I guess the thing to point out is that it's the way the credits move through the system. The full delivery is not necessarily all of a sudden going to leapfrog those credits through that much faster than what you're already doing now. Maybe in the land piece of it, it could. The overall approval piece of it, it's the same pace, because you still have to go through all the different regulatory approval processes. So, and then when we look at North Carolina, we see such a stark difference in the credit release versus the dollars coming in. But I think what I heard was that a lot of that is because of advanced planning and seed money coming in and getting those projects going ahead of time. So it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison between Kentucky and North Carolina because of how the credits move through. And if I'm wrong there, let me know, but that's just an observation.
I think you're right. And I think what we're looking at full delivery, the advantage of that is in one procurement step, I can go from not on this scale to here. And so effectively, I'm skipping this realm of, are we going to get there or not? And also, that's not the only benefit. That procedurally, that's a big benefit. You are exactly right, though. It doesn't have a huge effect on the time it's going to take to get more release credits. but it does, if we're able to execute it well, it could also benefit how we move through these steps, maybe a little faster, maybe a little more efficiently. And we have one vendor and one contract to manage throughout that. So we're looking looking at it from a highly efficient relative to what we do now, procurement method. And I don't know that it necessarily yields a better project or a faster project, but it does yield a commitment that not only us, but the regulatory agencies can hopefully get to a point where, you know, we do it successfully, and then they can be like, all right, well, you got a contract on that one, that's going, you know, and that becomes something they can rely on buying through us.
Right. Yeah. And again, I feel like full delivery is definitely a tool in the toolbox that you should have, but it's not going to instantly solve all the credit release backlog piece of it, but it's going to help.
Yeah. I think one thing it might help too is if a better relationship, a tighter, more responsible relationship with the designers and the contractors, because, you know, we tried sort of a pseudo full delivery with design build, and, you know, several times, and while all those projects are turning out fine, there's a little bit of a, you know, maybe the engineer and the contractor don't have the most efficient relationship, and so we get in a conundrum sometimes with regard to who's responsible for what throughout that process. And my expectation is that the full delivery procurement method won't have that, because you've got basically a GC and your mitigation provider, vendor that's managing all that and doesn't come down on us.
Rob and Scott, thank you again for taking the time to put this together. It's hugely illuminating. Just given the time, I don't want to lose sight of, you know, one of the things you talked about quite a bit, I think it was the last meeting, and we've talked about throughout, is, you know, as George says, full delivery isn't going to fix everything. It's one tool in the toolbox. As your data illustrates here, Rob, there isn't as much to fix as one would sort of think on first blush at the data. You know, you've really got to dive into this level that you've shown to say, okay, there's, you know, in a few select watersheds, there's a gap. But in any event, to the extent that you want to use full delivery and or the purchase of already released mitigation bank credits that are on the shelf, I've understood from our past few work group meetings that you don't currently have the legislative, or you don't currently have the procurement, the procurement rules are set up in a way that you can't do that right now in the way you would like to. And so my question is, given that we're in the middle of the legislative session, is there a legislative fix that you all would recommend that the work group in whatever way, shape, or form could help advance to make turnkey a more readily accessible tool in the toolbox?
Well, that's a great. I mean, I really don't know if that could have been better if I would have put 50 cents in a batting cage and tee this up. That was a great question, and that was absolutely perfect. But what we are doing is we're looking at making the permanent changes that were created in already with Finance Cabinet, Tourism Cabinet, and us, which has helped tremendously with our right-of-way acquisition. We're looking at changes that can make those permanent. And in addition, we've also started exploring and looking at a mechanism that could exempt us from 45A and 45 procurement, just kind of like the Transportation Cabinet and some universities already enjoy. In addition to that, we are looking at additional language with the Finance Cabinet about the possibility of folding compensatory mitigation procurement into an alternative delivery mechanism. Now, those discussions with the finance cabinet are ongoing. We'd like the ability to kind of to go forward and look at all options. So that's kind of where we're at. And, you know, and that's, Catherine, one of the things you pointed out is looking at just the initial first blush of that spreadsheet is that there are things that can be corrected, but it's certainly not the kind of issue that would trigger or require an automatic trigger in any type of legislation. So that's something we're going forward. We'd like to look at ways to either expedite or modify or deal with the procurement system or find an ability to recognize KRS 150, 255 funds as the unique trust and agency funds as they are, or, you know, look at an alternative delivery. So yeah, we're just looking to move forward.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the idea is not that there's any automatic trigger, right? The idea that we chatted about in a prior work group was more that there were, you all wanted the ability to be able to make purchases that were not tied to a budget cycle and that were, that changed the status of a mitigation procurement from a commodity to more of a service. So how, I guess my question is, what are the next steps? And maybe it's outlined on the slide here, what I'm trying to digest, but what are the next steps on sort of concretely making those fixes to procurement regs to give you all greater flexibility should you choose to use it?
I think I can't remember exactly how to say this, Scott, but correct me if I say it wrongly, but in the very immediate term, we would need an exemption in the budget bill that allows us to get emergency
Appropriate. Catherine, I've sent that's what I forwarded you yesterday.
Yeah. And
Got it. Okay, thanks for explaining that. So that would be an exemption in the budget bill. So that would be one concrete thing to advance in the next few weeks.
That would, yes, that would allow, again, you know, we've used it. If you knocked on our door tomorrow with the unicorn project, even though it's not budgeted, that would allow the ability to extend 150, 255 trust and agency funds that were not already budgeted. That's what that would do.
right.
Great.
That would also apply to something like a mitigation bank purchase of credits, because that's not something that we will have been able to plan for in our budget and would need that. They call it emergency, but it's just unprescribed sort of authority to spend more money. So that would cover all of that.
And it seems like what you just described is in no way, shape, or form in conflict with bullet number 1 or bullet number 2 on this slide.
Correct. You're right. I don't have a slide for what we're talking about right now, but this is really the main thing I want to maintain, that we don't repeat past mistakes as we go forward, because that can upend or undo, you know, all this progress that we've made. So that's really all you know, as far as having for our discussion about procurement legislation, whatever we do, let's just make careful that we're not doing these things right here. But we do know, like we said, for sure that, you know, we would need as a program and or an agency and a special line that says we're allowed to do appropriation increases outside of the regular budget cycle.
Yeah, which would be great. What are the next steps on that? And is there any way that the work group can be helpful to you on that?
I mean, you guys have probably significantly better contacts than Scott and I with regard to having an influence on what's in a bill is like a budget bill, for example. And I know that that's a tall order because apparently that's on a fast track or attempting to be on a fast track, whatever it is. So there's probably not a lot of time to get that in there. And that would be the highest priority. And that's that's kind of a short-term fix because I think it would come up every budget cycle potentially.
Okay, right, exactly. So then what would be the permanent fix?
I don't know that there is a permanent fix for that in particular.
Absent of the budget, and it's hard to kind of explain in a short term, but basically the budget can not withstand any existing statute. So even if something is in statute, something could happen in a budget where they could not withstand it. So,
but that said, what we've talked about with regard to creating full delivery as an alternative
delivery or exemption
or exempting the FILO program from the finance cabinet's version of 45A to sort of our own, a very careful surgical version of that, either one of those, would allow us to use the capital project process for budgeting for FILO projects. I don't know for sure if that would bring along like a mitigation bank credit purchase. It's possible, but I'm not sure. But it certainly would bring full delivery under the capital project umbrella as opposed to what it is now. And those projects we can budget at will. Like we do have an authority, but it's a lot different than having a biennium operational authority that's significantly tighter on like your operating budget.
And I think that's what one of the things we've looked at surgically is, even though, recognizing the past limitations that the Corps has brought to the General Assembly's attention in 33 CFR 332, is that they have the authority to approve the mitigation banks and in lieu fee project sites, and in addition, approve the proposed purchases of mitigation credits or our actual project site. The procurement methodology is entirely a state matter. So whether it's an exemption, an alternative delivery mechanism, looking at something similar to abandoned mine lands, that process, underground storage tanks, that process, there are different procurement methodologies. That's outside of the Corps' jurisdiction. We know what the Corps' ultimate approval authority is. The contracting methodology, that's ours. And so that's what I think surgically we can fix.
Yeah.
And again, we're having discussions with the finance cabinet on the alternative delivery mechanisms. There is the possibility of an exemption. It's just, I know, Catherine, if you really want to have some fun sometime, pull up 45 and 45A and just start looking at the amount of statutes that potentially would need to be changed or amended to get to either one of those. It's not going to be an easy lift.
Yeah. So.
Absent the budget bill, that's the one. Absent the one little, the low-hanging fruit that we've identified.
Right. So,
it just kind of gets us to our next meeting.
yeah, it does. I think we're looking to try to do another meeting. I think February ends on a Monday, so the week before that, the last full week of February, we'll try to schedule another work group meeting. And as usual, in the meantime, please reach out to us and let us know if you have thoughts or ideas about some of this. If you have actually dug into 45A and want to chat about it, I bet Scott would love it. Not that I wouldn't, but he's going to know more about it than me. And if you have questions about mitigation, projects, in lieu fee projects, or our procedures, or any of those numbers we showed today, let me know. I'm happy to discuss. And I'll PDF everything and send it out to the members. And don't forget, the live stream will be up there for viewing later. If you want to share that with other people of interest, please do. So it's an open door, open discussion. I hate it that we went over, but it was a great discussion today. Again, appreciate everybody's time and participation. This is very valuable to us.
And Dr. Clark, we've got an open door. Once you had a chance to deep dive or want to come back and spend an afternoon, we're more than welcome to entertain you and kind of walk you through everything. Just to, again, we know what we have to present to the Army Corps regulatorily in order to meet their requirements. And as Tim talked about, what North Carolina's requirements are. But if you think that type of information would be helpful in getting it out there, that would certainly go a long way with correcting some of the misperceptions and miscommunication that's happened down the hill with balance and fund balance and what's available, what's not available. If you think that's we're certainly have an open door.
Yeah. So. All right, everybody, appreciate it. We will be in touch, and I hope everybody stays warm and don't slide on the ice.
And it looks like we're going to have another snowmageddon possibility on Tuesday. So just this time of year, flip a coin.
Right. Stay safe and healthy.
And Lauren, you can send your contact information to me, scott.porter@ky.gov and rob.lewis@ky.gov. Do we have the information on the screen?
I can't get it up there.
Okay, so Lauren, just send us your contact information and we'll make sure you get included in everything.